concentrate on the Pharisees to see what was really going on. So, who are those people? Were those people in Jesus' time? They were religious, they were members of a religious group or party that frequently clashed with Jesus Christ over the interpretation of the law. The Pharisees were extremely accurate and detail oriented in all the matters pertaining to the law of Moses. And with that thought in mind, if the Pharisees at that time had not been following Jesus and his disciples, there would be no story for me to tell this morning. If they had been doing something for a good cause, there may or may not have been a story to tell. Yet, and we're going to our lesson, and that again, I'm coming from the New International Version, Luke the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 11. Verse 1 reads, one Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain field, and his disciples began to pick some heads of corn, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Three important words that we should remember what I just said. Pick, rub, and eat. Three words. Verse 2 says, some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Eating some grains, remember the word eat? Unlawful on the Sabbath. Can't do that. You can't eat those grains. However, yet eating on a Sabbath was not unlawful. You can eat. You can eat every day. That was not unlawful. God rested on the Sabbath day, but he didn't tell us not to eat. So what brought about this question from the Pharisees? Let's look at what the Pharisees said was unlawful. Remember the three words, pick, rub, eat? Pick, meaning that they were guilty of reaping. They picked that ear of corn. And that was considered working. Then they took the corn after they had picked it. They took it and they began to rub it. And as they rubbed it, the grains came from off of the stalk. Guilty of threshing. That's what they were guilty of, separating the grain from this stalk. They were working. And then they began, as they separated this, rubbing the grain in their hand, they took their breath and they blew this apart so that they could get to the grain. This fell off. And as they began to eat, it's called whining. So whining, when they rubbed it and they took all the things off of the corn, off of the grain, in order to remove the chaff, they were guilty because they were working. And then the disciples took this corn as they picked it and they mushed it together. And what they did as they mushed it together, they ate. That was called food preparation. They had to go through and prepare that grain to eat. Guilty because they were working. It was not permitted to do food preparations and do any of those sort of things according to what they called was the law. This was very serious according to the Pharisees, doing things that were forbidden on the Sabbath day. You just did something that you were forbidden to do. So why are you doing these things? The Pharisees asked. The Pharisees accused Jesus with breaking the law on the Sabbath when his disciples plucked corn. However, what the disciples did was not in violation of the law according to the Old Testament. The law specifically provided that a hungry person could eat of the fruit or grain of a field as they passed through it. Backing that up with Deuteronomy 23rd chapter, 24th and the 25th verse. accused. But it goes on to say, if you remember Ruth, when the some grains were left and Naomi so that they could glean, it was not a law. The Pharisees didn't take any sickles out there, as they used to call them that time, the blade where they cut it. They didn't do any of that. All they did was just pluck because they were hungry. Moving on to verse 3. Now, Jesus has an answer for them. He has an answer for us too when we question things. Jesus answered them, have you never read what David did when he and his companion were hungry? Referring to the Old Testament before David became king. Have you ever read? Have you gone back to see other stuff? You're accusing of other stuff, but have you just gone back to read what David did before he became king? Backing this up with scripture, 1 Samuel chapter 21, and I'm just going to give you a summary of it. David was fleeing from King Saul, who wanted to kill him. And then on the run, David comes to a city named Nob, N-O-B, the city where Pharisees rendered their service, where priests rendered their services to the Lord. So Nob was known as a city where all the priests lived because they rendered the ceremonial services to the Lord. Upon arriving in Nob, David met a priest named Ahimelech. So he meets a priest named Ahimelech at the tabernacle. Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David and said to David, why are you alone? See, his disciples weren't with him. His followers weren't with him right there because they didn't go in the tabernacle all together. So Elimelech asked, why are you alone? And why is there no other men with you? Even though all of them were hungry at the time because they had been on the run from King Saul. Well, David had to come up with an answer to the priest. And what he told the priest was not really the truth. He said, King Saul has commanded me to do some business for him. And I'm not to let any man, no man know anything about the business that I have to do. It's kind of like a hush hush. But I was commanded by King Saul to do this business. Not even my servants. So that's why I am alone. However, do you have any bread? Because I'm hungry. Do you have any bread? Give me 5 loaves of whatever you have so that we may eat. We're hungry. The priest answered David and said, I have no common bread. What I have is ceremonial bread. And the King James Version is referred to as showbread. David was hungry and needed something to eat. David was willing to take whatever the priest offered. But I have no common bread, the light bread, the wheat bread, and all that stuff. I have ceremonial bread. It was a ceremonial bread that was only to be eaten in a holy place, the tabernacle, by the priest. However, David petitioned for it, and he got it. He got the bread. Ahimelech went on and provided David with the showbread. Now remember, this bread is for what? Only for the priest to be eaten where? In a holy place in the tabernacle. We're moving on to verse 4. Jesus quoted scripture and reminded the scribes and Pharisees how David had set aside certain ceremonial laws when he ate the special bread that was intended only for the priests. So why did David eat the bread that was set aside for the priests and it was only supposed to be done in the Holy Land? You see, David was hungry with his servants. As he entered the house of God, the tabernacle, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat, the showbread. And not only did he eat it, he also gave some to his followers, his servants, his companions. Surely the Pharisees had read about that since it was God's law. Oh, you think they had? Then they would not have questioned Jesus because that was in the Old Testament with David. We in the New Testament, did you go back and read? Do we go back and read what happened and not confront people with what you're not supposed to do and what thus said the Lord? Because then you would know what Jesus did in the New Testament. There was no dispute about the fact that God set aside the Sabbath as a day to rest and honor the Lord in the Old Testament. God's creation was completed in 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested and set aside that day for rest. Jesus did, however, strongly refute the Pharisees' addition to the law. Because now they go ahead and add something else to the law. In other words, the Pharisees added their bit to this law about rubbing, picking, plucking, and feeding and preparation. They were not observing the Sabbath, really what it meant when you do something like that. When someone really wants to accuse you of something, the law changes to accommodate their accusation.